Coming up next, BookTV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, journalist Nicholas Wapshott and his latest book, Keynes Hayek, The Clash That Defined Modern Economics. The author of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher tackles economic theory, exploring the virtues of a free market versus one in which the government intervenes. He discusses the competing perspectives and the men who made them famous with U.S. business editor of The Economist, Matthew Bishop.
So, Nicholas, one of my favourite quotes from John Maynard Keynes is the one about how practical men are often slaves to some defunct economist. And you've written a book about two defunct economists, himself, Mr. Keynes, and Friedrich Hayek. Why do they matter today?
Well, it turns out that the great dividing line in terms of modern economics between whether you start interfering in an economy and try to manage it, and those people who said, don't do that because it'll only cause an enormous mess and we'll have to clear it up eventually, was 80 years ago when John Maynard Keynes, who was the most innovative economist of his day, and certainly the most influential economist of the 20th century, started working out theories which looked at the economy in a different way. Instead of looking at it as a series of business propositions, which traditionally is what economists did, he started looking at as if he'd hovered above economics and looked at it in what became known as macroeconomics. He looked at the big picture about the different elements, the different moving parts, and also because he was talking at the end of the 20s when Britain had suffered a great deal of unemployment, and at a time when, come 1929 and the subsequent collapse of the American economy, large-scale unemployment was a great problem. He was looking at it from a practical point of view. Is there anything we can do to the economy? Is there anything a government may do to an economy which might cure some of this terrible poverty, this terrible conditions of people not being able to find work for years on end? And as that was 80 years ago, but it turns out that this key division between whether you interfere or don't interfere in an economy turns out to be the principal political issue of this electoral cycle. In fact, it's been submerged for a very long time, not least because the Keynesians, when the Keynesians managed to succeed, enjoyed 30 years, I suppose, between 1945 and 1975, of intervening in the economy and managing it for the benefit of, well, let's say the population, but I mean, they made the economy bigger. Between 1975 and 2008, say, we had a different thing. We had a Friedmanite economy, a notion that Keynes was right in principles, but what you should do is to try to ration the amount of new money that you ease into an economy so that an economy wouldn't get out of kilter with itself.
And Friedman was sort of same school as Hayek in this sense.
He started off anyway, yes, as a sort of son of Hayek, or a grandson of Hayek maybe. I mean, he actually didn't think very much of his economics, but that's a sort of neither here nor there. The principle was what Keynes and Hayek fell out over was economics. But actually the strength of Hayek turned out to be a corollary to interfering in the economy. Because Keynes suggested that you can pump money into the economy, you can directly employ people. A government may do that. A government may cut taxes drastically. It may ease credit to ensure that business activity picks up. Notwithstanding all of these various things that a government may do, Hayek said yes, but all of those things entail increasing the size of the government. And there's a problem about that. And that is that the more you increase the size of a government, the larger the proportion of an economy is spent by government agents rather than the people themselves, that is through taxation rather than people spending out of their own pockets, the more likely you are to have a tyranny in society. And so he added something which certainly has found, I think, a great echo in the say the Tea Party movement among a lot of libertarian thinkers in America, and even some conservatives, that actually it's the government itself which is the problem. And that, of course, is something which has resonated since Ronald Reagan, or maybe even since Barry Goldwater in the Republican tradition. But again, it's the distaff side of the family. It's the main tradition in republicanism has always been rather like the Conservative Party in Britain, of embracing everybody together. But the Hayekians had a different point of view. They had a very absolutist point of view about what should or should not be done. And government itself turned out to be the problem as far as Hayek was concerned. And because Keynes's solutions, whether they worked or not, was irrelevant in a way, the fact was that even if they did work, and let's say they do work, The fact is that Hayek said, well, and so did Friedman, said that's a bad idea because we don't want the state to be too big, because that checks our individual choices, and that is the basis of an undermining of free choice. And
now, what strikes me as very interesting in the book is the extent to which you get into their personalities and how Keynes and Hayek interacted with each other.
Yeah.
And you think about the debate today in politics, and there's a real shouting match going on. The Tea Party right that endorses Hayek is vitriolic in its opposition to Keynes, and likewise the Keynesians, Paul Krugman, I guess, being an obvious voice of the Keynesian school, though I think we can disagree as to how much Keynes would actually have endorsed Krugman's position, but there's this sort of intolerance, whereas in the book it's quite clear that Hayek certainly had enormous admiration for Keynes. I'm not sure whether Keynes admired Hayek quite so much, but maybe you talk a bit about how that relationship developed over time, and did they really respect each other?
They really quite liked each other in the end. Certainly you're right about Hayek liking Keynes. Keynes, of course, Hayek already knew, in as much as Keynes was famous already by the time that Hayek moved into full employment as an economist. And he did that through pointing out that the Treaty of Versailles would be tragic for Europe and would lead to a Second World War, which was, of course, all true. Hayek, of course, who was an Austrian and was in the Austrian army during World War I, he knew from his own personal experience that the amount of inflation that totally devastated Austria at the end of the war was... the Keynes was right about it, that was the way towards extreme politics. And so he started off knowing Keynes as a sort of mythical, heroic figure. And in a way, that never really departed from Hayek. Hayek always maintained an enormous respect for Keynes, as, by the way, did almost everybody who ever came across him. There's no doubt that Keynes is, I mean, if it wasn't for Churchill, I don't think that you could doubt that Keynes was the greatest Englishman of the 20th century. He was an astonishing creature. I only wish we could meet him. I mean, he was plainly a person who was capable of juggling with many different balls at the same time. I mean, his achievements are astonishing. Even if just one career was on track and good, he would have been an astonishing person. But actually, he ran King's College, Cambridge. He bought pictures for the National Gallery. He was on an insurance company.
He was a day trader as well.
He was a day trader. He used to stay in bed until noon every day on the telephone to his stockbroker, saying, "Sell this." But actually, he dealt mostly in currencies. But yeah, he was a speculator. He really understood the market more than even the people who say that they admire the market.
Because with hindsight, it's kind of odd that today he is just seen as the face of big government, whereas in fact, he was actually, in many ways, an ardent capitalist, or could be credited with saving the capitalist system back in the 1930s, when there were much more extreme views as to what should replace what had brought about the 1929 stock market crash and so forth.
It is one of the problems, of course, of knowing a little too much about political theory or economic theory in the modern political debate, because words are bandied around so absurdly. So, Obama's a socialist and Keynes is a socialist. Well, not really. But anyway, to go back to the Keynes and Hayek thing, so the problem was that Hayek was brought in by Lionel Robbins, who was the professor of economics at the LSE, specifically in order to counter Keynes. So the thing was set up actually already in the first place for what could be a very vituperative battle. Lionel Robbins had already had a battle with Keynes in a Bank of England committee, or a government committee, about the use of the Bank of England. And that started off pretty sharply. You must remember, of course, that this is not your gentle to and fro of an argument in a bar. This is pretty high-flown stuff, fought on pretty tough measures. Keynes was an old Etonian, come King's College person, and his stock in trade really was sarcasm. That's what he could demolish. Ad hominem attacks on people and sarcasm, I think, had protected him, as every other schoolboy, from each other all those years. Hayek was a different sort of thing. He was literally buttoned up. I mean, his jacket had 3 buttons all done up. And he was very well mannered. They were both bourgeois, they were both brought up to treat each other properly. But when it came to important things like disagreements over economic debates, then they just took their gloves off. And so right from the very beginning, the Keynes-Hayek debate was very sour. They were very rude to each other, to the extent that other academics came in and pulled them apart and said, "This is not the way to conduct an academic debate. Please don't talk in these terms."